Welcome, everyone. My name is Jonah Everett, and I am the president of the Canadian Political Science Association. Given the recent attention paid to the discovery of the 215 graves of children from the Kamloops residential school, I would like to take a few minutes at the beginning of this annual meeting of our association to offer our collective sympathy and solidarity to all impacted by this discovery, and to all survivors of residential schools who are confronted with the pain of the past. I would also encourage us to reflect on the role our discipline has played in supporting the Canadian settler state. While these events have highlighted past policies of assimilation that produced the residential school system, we cannot ignore how we as a discipline continue to be complicit in supporting both past and current colonial impulses in our teaching and in our research. In 2016, the CPSA created the Reconciliation Committee to ensure that our association does not forget our past and continues to move forward in addressing the recommendations that came out of the TRC. To discuss how important it is for us to understand the impact of these recent events, I would like to call upon Dr. Joyce Green of the University of Regina, who is the chair of the Reconciliation Committee, to say a few words. Joyce?
Thanks, Jonah. My thanks to Professor Everett for making this time and space for Sarah and me to speak to you. We all weep for the children in unmarked graves at the Kamloops and everywhere else where they will be found. They must be found if we are to follow the call for action on this matter from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I remind all of us that this atrocity is one of many, and that while it is historic, it is also continuing. Its motivations continue in other policies and practices of the state and in the political culture of the state and in the canonical teaching of Canadian political science. Whatever else it means to Canada, colonialism is the motivation for Indigenous annihilation in Canada. Every Indigenous related policy and practice flowed from that. Nothing can distance the state or this and every other government from responsibility for the evil intentions and consequences of the residential school policy. That policy occurred in a context, the colonial impulse to appropriate Indigenous lands and resources, and through mechanisms such as the Indian Act, the residential school system, the assault on and dispossession of the Métis, the enforced relocation of the Inuit, and all other similar policies that this state has enforced upon Indigenous people. We must acknowledge and reject the whole idea of this, the violence of colonial occupation, the foundational land theft that produced this state, the legitimatory racism that justifies all of this, the fusion of political objectives with ecclesiastical ones that led to church and state assaults on Indigenous identities, the cultivation of racist fundamentals into Canadian cultures, which continue to play out in policing interactions and in state institutions everywhere in Canada, including in La Belle Province, despite Premier Legault's failure to acknowledge systemic racism in Quebec. Our systemically racist political cultures produce the conditions for contemporary genocides, such as the missing and murdered Indigenous women and children body count. And fundamentally, Canada squats on Indigenous territory and denies Indigenous title and its incidents while fighting Indigenous claims for restitution, recognition, and justice in court, and by trying to negotiate rather than implement our rights, while crying crocodile tears for the suffering of Indigenous people. All of this must be named, researched, theorized, and demonstrated by scholarship and framed in the moral universe taken up by political philosophy. As a discipline, political science has too often provided the intellectual legitimation and the policy options for much of the colonial enterprise and for the minimization of Indigenous human rights. We must do better than this for all of our students. Our credibility as a serious scholarly discipline depends on this, and doing so constitutes a collective act of reconciliation. I am grateful to Professor Sarah Nicol for joining us to speak directly about the children's graves at Kamloops to Shequemek. She is also part of that community. Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you both for your words and for inviting me to be here today. I'm speaking today from Treaty 6 territory and the Métis homelands near Edmonton, Alberta. And I come today wearing two hats, one as a historian of 20th century Indigenous political activism in Canada, and one as a member of Kamloops to Secwepemc and an intergenerational residential school survivor. My ancestors and my family members attended this school. Some made it home to the houses that they could see from the residential school, but were rarely allowed to go back to. Others did not. Some died, others disappeared, and we still don't know these stories. When the news broke about the discovery of this mass grave, not many Indigenous people were surprised. It's something that was already talked about in our communities, in the hushed tones of children trying to understand the things that they had seen at the schools, some having dug graves for their peers, telling people about that as children, but also as adult survivors giving testimony to the TRC, bravely, boldly telling their stories in that and other contexts. And in fact, it's the testimony of those survivors I recently learned that was fundamental, integral to the discovery of not just this mass grave at Kamloops, but also others at residential schools. And I'd like us to sit with that knowledge for a moment. The technology to find these graves still relies on knowing exactly where to look. It was the children who remembered burying others or heard about the graves who told archaeologists where to look. Without these stories, those graves remain hidden. When we put this in the context of reconciliation, how we might move forward at this moment, it becomes very difficult to see past something like this. How is it possible that there are so many children buried in mass unmarked graves, cast aside, unvalued, and forgotten? Their bodies literally used to cover up the truth about these schools. How can we have reconciliation when churches and governments were involved in these decisions and their cover-ups? When churches and others still refuse to help the truth come out by providing open access to their records? How can there be reconciliation when there is still no truth, where Indigenous peoples themselves have to work to expose what really happened? How can there be reconciliation when the TRC made recommendations to systematically search out these graves, locate these graves, find missing children, and this went unheeded? How can we have reconciliation in an ongoing crisis like this? Our communities are hurting with renewed trauma, but also renewed determination to find our people. Others are now moving forward with similar technology on residential school grounds, and I firmly believe that this should be prioritized and paid for by the federal government and the churches. More broadly, I also believe that this brings into sharper focus other debates, such as the memorializing of controversial figures like MacDonald and Langevin, who even the staunchest defenders of them, I feel would struggle to press their cause in this moment. How can we still defend actors like this? How can we be okay with coming across statues of individuals who designed and supported the residential school system and other racist and oppressive policies, knowing that hundreds of children were not even given the dignity of having their existence recognized? How can we expect Indigenous people to live in this reality? To see the Prime Minister kneeling, to see tokenistic efforts claiming reconciliation? I don't think we can. And I'd just like to conclude by bringing this back to my community. We have been uplifted in ways that have been unprecedented. We've received so much support from communities all over. Right now, this moment, June 5th, there's a massive convoy of people that are making their way to Kamloops to pay their respects. Others have made donations. Others have volunteered their expertise. Others have taken on the emotional labor of speaking out against white supremacy and colonialism. Kamloops to Secwepemc has been so overwhelmed that it compiled a list available on its website outlining the various ways that allies can support the community. It includes both big and small ways to turn outrage into action, and I encourage you to look into that if you're able. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the CPSA, I'd like to thank Drs. Green and Nicol for their thoughtful, timely, and very important comments today. As Joyce once said, reconciliation is a process, and it begins not with the survivors, but with those who have benefited from it, recognizing our role in supporting and maintaining the systematic oppression experienced by the Indigenous peoples of this land. It's with this recognition that change can occur.